All right, everybody, welcome to our May 2020 Kent in-service. So thank you all for joining. This is definitely pretty cool being able to do it on Zoom. So we are recording this training so that folks can watch it later. And this is sort of our third part of our three-piece series with Meg Garey from A Better Chance for Our Children. So she's a total pro at the moment. So in just a minute, I'll turn it over to her. But just a couple logistics is because this is a recorded training. If you ask any questions, please do not be case specific, speak in general terms, because we do put this on our YouTube channel. And while it is public, mostly only CASAs watch it, but it is still public. So anybody can watch it. So just make sure you're good about your CASA, not giving any CASA details. Also, I'm going to make sure that I mute everybody, but then Meg is awesome at using the chat box. So if you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, it has a little chat box. So if you have any questions, type a message in there. And speaking of the chat box, I can see pretty much everybody here, and I've got everybody on my attendance list. But if you could do me a favor and type your full name in the chat box, that gives me kind of a way I can double check to make sure that attendance has been taken. And then my final thing is, because I can see all of your beautiful faces, you do not need to complete an in-service form because I verify your attendance right now. So I will turn it over to Meg. Meg, take it away.
All right, thanks so much. I'm so glad to have this time with you. I am Meg Garey, and I am Executive Director of A Better Chance for Our Children. And if you're not familiar with us, we provide foster care, adoption, and post-adoption services for the state of Delaware. So we have an office in Wilmington and an office in Milford, and we serve the entire state from those offices. And today we're going to be talking about honoring birth-family connections. Although what I will be talking about some pieces will be sort of adoption specific, I think we all know that the same sort of philosophies and approaches will apply while a child is still working towards reunification. So even when we don't know a child's path, the honoring of birth-family connections is really important. So before a decision is made, and then let's say a child is adopted. So we're going to talk about those different pieces. As Lauren said, we will use the chat function, and I will encourage, I'll take time to stop and encourage you guys to unmute and ask questions as makes sense. So give me just a moment to share my screen, and then we will get ourselves started. So as I said, today we're going to talk about honoring birth-family connections. And let's start with some of the basics, right? So let's talk about what this looks like for our kids. Our kids, they're going to miss their birth families, even when their experiences some of their experiences were negative, and even when their memories are painful. They're going to experience loss, no matter the age when they were separated from their birth family. It is a loss, even if it happens day one. They're going to miss their birth families, even if they aren't asking about them or talking about them. It's going to be on their mind. We know that. And so as we'll talk about, we want to make sure that they have the space, that we are giving them space when we can, to ask those questions and have those feelings. Our kids deserve to know their story. It is theirs, and we need to help them make sense of it and integrate it and all of those things. And they're going to miss their birth families, even if they don't know them or remember them, right? We won't talk about it much today, but for those of you who may have watched other trainings I've done, we talked about the concept of ambiguous loss, which is that idea that it's not a concrete loss the way some things are, that we sort of know what it was and we know what we lost. But that ambiguous loss is that idea of we're grieving someone who's still alive, but that either we don't know them or we can't contact them, or they're not safe for us to be around, and that's really hard. And so they're going to miss them in any circumstance. So let's talk about their parents. Their parents, they did the best they could. They're doing the best that they can. They've often experienced their own trauma. We know that when we're talking about children who are in foster care, it is often due to their parent's own experience of trauma and perhaps foster care and whatever other challenges there may be. Our parents are experiencing their own grief and loss in this situation, and that needs to be acknowledged. And we need to keep in mind that it may be too painful for them to maintain some contact. So that's often hard for foster adoptive families to understand, to say, I'm here, I'm making the space, I want them to have this contact, I want to do this. And then, and birth parents are maybe pulling away or aren't interested. And it's because that's really complicated and they have a lot of their own feelings mixed up in it. And so we want to be thoughtful about that and not be judgmental about that. And then always remembering that, a parent's love for a child is different than their capacity to parent. The capacity to parent it takes a lot. For any of you who have parented, it takes a lot. And so for those parents who are having a lot of big challenges, they might not have that capacity. And it's not because they don't love their children or they don't want to parent them. It's because their challenges have meant that they don't have the capacity to do so. So some of the other basics, around honoring birth family, our birth parents, they're the reason our kids are in the world. And so we have to honor them and speak about them with empathy. Our children, A, they pick up on everything. And B, they deserve to have the experience of their parents being spoken of with care and empathy, because it's where they came from. And when their parents are not spoken of well, they tend to internalize that into their experiences or who they are or who they're supposed to be. And so we, again, just need to be thoughtful about how we're doing that. And of course, there are times when we have a lot of really big feelings and sometimes negative feelings about, what has happened to our children, maybe because of their birth parents or birth family members, and we need to set that aside when it comes to talking about them in front of our kids. And here's just some examples of some language that can be helpful for kids, to tell them, we can love people even when they make mistakes. And sometimes parents make bad decisions that change. Making bad decisions doesn't make them a bad person. And sometimes parents weren't taken care of when they were young and didn't learn how to take care of themselves. And that makes it hard for them to take care of others. And so some of what we're going to talk about today is how do we frame this for our kids so that they can, again, make sense of their story and not feel sort of shame around it, but understand that it is about challenges their parents experienced, and to really understand what those challenges were, not just sort of these broad, well, they were having a hard time kinds of things. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more specifically as we go along. Another piece just that is also important when we're thinking about honoring birth family is specifically situations around transracial adoption, because it means that there are more pieces of this child's identity that perhaps need to be acknowledged and recognized and honored and addressed specifically. So we have to be, parents who are fostering or adopting transracially need to be intentional about honoring a child's culture and diversity, their religious background, whatever it may be. And they're going to have to shift to see their family in a different way if a child from a different race or culture is going to be a part of their family. Their family is now, it's not what it was. It's culturally different now, and they have to embrace that. And the other piece about this is for our kids where we do have some information about their families, or they do have some memories about what life was, let's honor some of the traditions that they had as a family. When I think back to my birthdays growing up, right, the tradition in my family was that when you woke up in the morning, there was a present at the end of your bed. Just one. There was just one to start the day, and then you got to pick whatever you wanted for dinner, even if that was the odd combination of clam chowder and pizza that my brother picked. But that was our tradition, right? And so if kids have memories of those, or if an aunt or uncle shared that information, or if a birth parent shared that information, then let's honor that, and let's make sure we're making space so we can ask those questions. We have to be intentional about that, because how special is it to have those connections as we grow, even if we've lost pieces of our birth family? So honoring those traditions is really important. And then this piece, right? We have to hold on to this piece as well throughout our conversation. that a termination of parental rights is a legal reality, right? It's a legal reality. It is not a termination of relationship or history. And so, again, we have to remember that our kids have all of these pieces. So if they're not able to be reunified and that we get to that point of termination of parental rights, that is a legal change in their status. What does that do to their emotions or their memories or their connections or their genetics, right? It's just a legal reality. And so we have to hold those other pieces and make sure we're honoring the relationships and honoring the history. So I'm gonna shift to talk about sort of our kids and how they pull their story together, but I'm happy to stop here and see if anybody has questions before I go to our next section. I know there's not a lot of information to have questions about yet, but I just want to be thoughtful about giving you that chance since you're not in the room and I can't see what your your faces may be doing. All right. So let me see. Okay. All right. So I'm going to go on to our next section. All right. So their story. We have to help our kids acknowledge the significant people, places, and events from their past to honor their history and help them create a cohesive narrative. So what does that mean, right? So we're going to break it down a little bit. But when we talk about having a cohesive narrative, it means that our kids need to understand how they got to where they are and the reasons behind it, and to know what some of those pieces are. You know, I'm a person who was raised by my birth parents. I have been told stories about my early life, my whole life, right? I know the circumstances of my birth, right? I know the things that happened before I had memory to hold on to them. And our kids don't always know all those things, or things were happening around them that they didn't understand. And so they don't have a cohesive narrative of it. And so we need to help them do so. So how do they create that narrative? Well, let's remember, they're going to do it with or without us. And so we have to be intentional of helping them integrate their story. So this may be through, My Life services while they're still in foster care. It may be work that they do with foster and birth parents together. It may be something that they do with adopted parents. And we need to give them space to share their feelings and ask their questions. For folks who maybe aren't familiar with My Life as a service, it is based on a model created by a woman named Darla Henry. It's the 3-5-7 model. And basically, I won't get into the details, but basically, it's the idea that we need to help kids sort of look at where they've come from, figure out what that means for who they are, and then figure out what that means for moving forward. And it was initially developed to help kids sort of get ready for permanency, but it can be used and applied in many different ways. And so for many of our kids, when they have a goal of termination of parental rights, or maybe or a plan for, or some concurrent planning, that they can have this service. Even when they're little, that will just be a life book that is made for them and can be used and will be given to their parents. And then when they're older, they're a part of that process. There are activities that are done, there's pages that are filled out, and they get to be a part of pulling all of that together. So that's something that as a service can be used, but helping them create their narrative can happen in a number of ways. And also as a service can be provided post-adopt, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. All right, so kids are they have a lot of questions. These are questions that kids who've been adopted, or frankly kids who are in foster care have. They may not have this information, right? Do my birth parents love me? Do they think about me? What do they look like, right? Because some of our kids, they don't have that information. If we couldn't find pictures, or if their birth father wasn't known or named, they're stuck with these questions. Do my birth parents have any talents or hobbies or interests, right? Maybe I really like this one thing. Is that where it came from? When they want to know that. What traits did I inherit? Are there personality things? Are there looks? Again, are there talents? Are there skills that I inherited? If I called them, would they what would they do? Would they want to meet me? Are they thinking of me? And then, some of the a very practical question is, what do I call them? Especially our kids who've been adopted, figuring out what to call everybody can be tricky. And I think what's ideal is for adoptive parents to be open to what feels most comfortable for their kids, and to let their kids know that they recognize that they have more than one mom and more than one dad, and that they're, I think for adoptive parents and foster parents to not be threatened by that, right? To accept that it's just the reality that they have more than one mom, and they have more than one dad, and more grandparents and more aunts and uncles. And what's important is that we recognize that there's enough space, there's enough love for all of that, right? It doesn't need to be an either or, right? It needs to be a both and for these pieces. And then some of the biggest questions, right? Why didn't they want me? Why can't I be with them? Why couldn't they take care of me? And again, it may be that no one is telling this child that your parents didn't want you, but we know that that's something they internalize, right? They internalize that sense of, well, they just didn't want me. They just didn't want me enough to try hard. They just didn't, right? But we know that's not what it is. And so it's our job to help them reframe some of those questions and then answer some of those questions. And I really like this quote. I would have said who said it, but I can't remember because it was at a conference. But it's hard to have peace when you don't have all the pieces, which is, again, what we're talking about, why we have to honor birth family, why we have to help them pull their story together. And so some of these pieces are about, finding the answers that we can find for them, and then also helping them acknowledge and grieve the answers that we just can't find. We may never be able to answer some of these questions, especially these on this previous slide. A lot of these questions are some that just may never be answered. And so we have to acknowledge that for our kids and help them grieve that. So when they do ask these questions and when we do have these conversations, our responses matter. And so we need to be thoughtful about how we do that. If we don't answer their questions, they're going to feel shame for asking, right? Like it wasn't okay, that maybe the information is too scary to be shared. And so they're going to feel shame for asking. So we need to answer their questions of our ability. And we need to do that in an honest way. We need to be honest. We need to be straightforward. We need to be clear about what they're asking and answer that specifically, and try not to go on and on and on and on, as we sometimes do when maybe we're feeling anxious about something. We need to figure out what they're asking. We need to answer it specifically, and then we need to stop talking, which can be hard to do, but it's important. The other thing is, I think we as adults sometimes have a tendency to sort of fall back on language that we're used to, not necessarily language that will make sense to a child. So if we say, mom was working really hard towards her case plan, but just couldn't do it. What does case plan mean to a child, right? Like, they don't know what that means. And they might not say excuse me, what does case plan mean? No, they're going to be flooded with emotion. And so they're not going to be able to do that. So we need to help them understand that, there's a judge involved, and what do they do? And we throw these things around like, well, your worker this or their worker that, right? That we need to be thoughtful about the language we use. So I'm going to give some examples. It's not going to cover everything, but I'm going to give some examples on the next few slides just to think about. Before I do that, though, we're just, again, a few more just broad pieces of how we should approach this. And trying to use person-first language, right? So a child who is in foster care as opposed to a foster child, a parent struggling with addiction as opposed to an addicted parent, those kinds of things, right? So person-first language. And then providing context for challenges as opposed to, just saying, well, they struggled with addiction. What does that have to do with why they can parent or not, right? Because we all have challenges, right? We may have mental health challenges, emotional challenges. We may have substance challenges, but whether or not that impacts my parenting, that depends, right? So we have to be specific about what it is about that challenge that means they couldn't parent or they were struggling to parent. And again, there will be some examples on the next few slides. The other piece is sometimes, as I said, like, we have to be honest, we have to include their information, they deserve to know their story. But sometimes, you're going to say something in one way to a 4-year-old and then a different way to a 6-year-old and a different way to an 8-year-old and then a 10-year-old and on and on and on, right? So sometimes we need to sort of separate out some information so that they always know their story, but it's told in a different way, or they have additional details as they grow. All right, so here are some examples of language that you can use. So again, just sort of general language. There are lots of reasons why some children are separated from their families and they go into foster care. All the reasons have to do with parents and not the kids. That one is really important and may be hard for kids to internalize, but we have to keep sending that message, because sometimes they get the opposite message, that it's their fault. People tell them, well, if you hadn't told so-and-so this, or if you hadn't whatever. So they internalize that sense of guilt and shame. And so we need to tell them that, a lot of kids who experience foster care do so because of challenges parents are having. It's nothing to do with the kids. Other things, your parents needed help with, whatever it may be, getting a job, learning how to take care of their kids, helping them learn to make safe choices about what they put in their body, right? That they needed help with, and then these specific things. And then, for some of our kids, and, maybe for parents who weren't able to maybe work on their case plan, to talk about the fact that they weren't able to sort of understand and accept and embrace their role as a parent. Which may still be hard for kids to understand, but it's important to give it some language, as opposed to, well, they just weren't around, or they just left, or they just couldn't do it, to give it a little bit more language. Oh, I'm sorry. All right, so here again is just another page with some examples more specifically, right? So mental illness is when a person's brain is not working the way it's supposed to. Just like people have problems with their bodies, sometimes a person has a problem with their brain. So if we're talking to a kid, or we're putting information in their life book about their parent having mental health challenges, we need to explain what that is. And this is just one example. There are other ways. Same thing for parents with addiction and substance abuse. Your mother, father has a disease called addiction. Addiction makes people feel like they need a grown-up drink called alcohol or another kind of drug to feel okay. That can make a person act strange in ways they cannot control. And so it's just, again, it's an example of how you're going to break these things down. And then, maybe for our families who struggle with homelessness, your mother or father was homeless when they were trying to take care of you. This means they didn't have a home where you could sleep every night, make meals, and keep your belongings, right? We got to break it down. They have to understand why this struggle means they could not be parented by their birth parents. Because as we're going to talk about, their understanding of their story makes a huge difference, and taking the shame out of their story makes a huge difference, because a lot of our kids do experience shame around the reasons why they're in foster care, or the very fact that they're experiencing foster care. And so we need to help break it down and give it that language. So some advice for adoptive parents, and I think foster parents as well, is to, what we say, sort of be the bridge. They won't know that it's okay to talk about their feelings about their birth families unless birth parent or adoptive parents or foster parents consistently give them a clear message that it's okay to do so. Because when you leave the door open through lifelong conversation and acceptance of whatever they are feeling about their adoption, right, their story, it's their experience, you end up being a bridge to their past, present, and future. So this is something we like to talk to adoptive parents about in terms of creating that safe space. Okay, so I'm going to pause and see what questions there may be. So I see one in the chat box, which is, at what age should a child be explained all the different layers of the birth parents versus foster parents? So the first sort of answer to that is always, right? There should always be some language around, if it's foster, adoption, birth parents, that there are books that you can use. There, again, you could have pictures around, or life book, whatever it may be, that it should always be a conversation. And then at what age you add some of the layers, I like the way that you put that, like you add some of the layers, is a little bit going to depend on the child, and just sort of recognizing what typical development is and where that child may be or not. And so as a child moves into their sort of school age years, they're going to naturally ask more questions. And so that's a good time to be adding some of those details and that maybe more complicated information. And then it's the same thing when they hit another developmental milestone, let's say the teenage years, they're going to ask more questions again, because their brain is going to be in a different place and it's going to want different information, as opposed to where they were when they were younger. And so it's just going to shift as they get older. So I hope that answered what you were looking for. Feel free to add another question in the chat box if not. Does anyone else have questions they want to add to the chat box, or to feel free to unmute or raise your hand and ask a question? Okay. All right, I see one more. So I like, this is a very good question. Thank you, Gwen. Should an actual book of pictures and memories be created? Yes. And so that can be what's called a life book, which can be created through that My Life service I was talking about, or it can be something that parents create on their own. You would be amazed what kind of pictures and information can be found online through Facebook or other online platforms, and pulling that information together based on what information the division has about a child. It is really important. And yes, an actual book should be pulled together, and it should be available to a child. Again, why sometimes we separate out information is if we want to have a life book or a photo album or something that's put together for a kid that helps tell their story, and that's something we want them to have access to when they're young, then maybe, again, there are additional pages that get added with additional details as they grow, or again, it's separated out into additional, like a letter or something that the parents hold on to, but that it is something that should be made available to them and should be around. So great questions. I really appreciate it. Because you guys ask questions about things I probably should have mentioned or forgot to, or just haven't gotten to yet. So I appreciate it. Okay. So I'm going to move on to our next section, but please feel free to keep adding questions to the chat box. And again, I'll give you the opportunity to unmute and ask questions. And I didn't mention this at the beginning, but we will stop partway through for a short break, because we know that Zoom attention spans are tricky. So we're going to honor that as we talk about honoring things, and take a break partway through. Okay. So there we go. So we're going to stop here, and we're going to watch a video of adoptees talking about their experience and how they view their first families or birth families. People use different language for that. So give me just a moment to get this. I'm going to start it, and I'm going to pause. And if you guys can hear it, if you can just give me a thumbs up, that would be great, because I want to make sure that everything's working okay. So hold on.
What do you wonder about your birth mom?
Wonder.
Okay, could you guys hear that? Thumbs up, thank you.
What do you wonder about your birth mom?
Wonder what they look like, and how they feel. And they took me when somebody else took me away.
How they felt when someone else took you away?
Yeah, my parents keep saying that they felt really sad. I don't really know them. I just know their names. And I don't get to see them because I don't know where they are or where they live.
I want to talk about or hear about your birth parents and what you think of them, if you see them or if you don't see them very much, if you miss them.
Sometimes I wake up in the night, like, just sort of upset, and I think about them sometimes. And I don't usually have too much feelings about them, but when I do have some, it usually lasts a long time. So it takes a little while to get over it. Sometimes my parents help me, sometimes they don't. Sometimes I get angry and sometimes I don't. But all in all, it doesn't happen that much.
Every time I see them, I feel really happy. And then when I have to go, I don't feel happy anymore. But I'm still glad that I get to see them. I sometimes call him my half-brother or my brother because I have two. And I sometimes joke around with them and say I have one whole brother because I have two halves.
Two halves.
I wanted to know who my birth family were because I had a lot of questions. The first question I had was, why was I put up for adoption?
I've never met my birth father. He left, which is, to the best of my understanding, part of the reason that my mother, I'm the youngest of 5, and she kept all my older siblings who are significantly older than me. And so to my understanding, like, part of the reason that she could not keep me is one of my siblings has some disabilities, and then also my birth father left. And so to my understanding, that's why I was placed for adoption, so that I could have better resources. And
Sure. How does that make you feel knowing that your siblings were kept and you weren't?
I mean, that's always something I've grappled with.
I met my birth parents just a few years ago, and I always felt like standing closer to my mom than my birth mom.
Because that's a person they've grown up with, and you've actually you kind of know them a little bit better than you do your birth mom, which is kind of for people who aren't adopted, that's kind of a weird thing to say.
Yeah.
That you know a different mother more than you know the person that gave birth to you.
Sometimes I feel kind of guilty describing my birth mom as kind of a stranger because she kind of felt like a stranger for a while.
Yeah, I kind of feel the same way. Not really as in guilty. I find it like a new experience and it feels really good to get to meet the person that gave birth to me, and it's just a really good feeling and really nice to meet her for the first time.
It's kind of hard to lose contact with them.
Yeah.
Are there things you wish you could say to them right now?
Well, I keep a journal with notes and stuff, just in case I find them, or if they find me, I'll just give them the journal and then have to say.
Do you have a relationship with your birth parents?
Not at the moment. I haven't really shown any interest in pursuing a connection with them. I don't have any hard feelings toward them. I am, however, interested just to see about their whereabouts and how they're doing.
So you're interested in where they are, how they're doing, but not really interested in pursuing a search?
Not yet, but I think I will want to sometime in the future.
And what do you foresee, your family or parents' involvement in your search?
My mom has definitely talked to me about starting a search or showing some interest, and where I'm coming from in my background, because every Mother's Day and my adoption day when my adoption was finalized, it's always, she says oh, I thank Claire for you every day and stuff, so I think she'd love to meet her and my father as well.
I only have one half-brother, but I don't know where the other 4 brothers that I have. 4? Yeah, I have 4 others, but I don't know where they are. My birth dad never told me.
Okay, so that was a video giving you the opportunity to hear what kids think about in terms of their stories and the questions that they have. And I always think it's so important to hear from our kids directly, because I think sometimes we're surprised at the things that they know, and then we're surprised at the things that they don't know, and the things we think they understand but don't. And so having those conversations and hearing what they have to say and hearing what questions they have is so important. Okay, so now we're going to talk about what sort of openness in adoption can look like, and recognizing that relationships with birth family will be different for every family. And so we need to be, we need to be aware of the fact that it needs to be treated uniquely. So I'm going to go through this section. I saw there was a question that popped up, but now it won't come back to me. So I'm going to go through this question, and then I'll pull that back up before we take our break. Sometimes Zoom does not treat me well. Like now, there we go, got it. Okay, so there is this grid that we're going to break down and talk about what it means. But basically what we're looking at here is the degree of open-heartedness and the degree of contact and how those things intersect and what that means. And so this is a concept developed by Lori Holden, and she wrote a book, The Open-Hearted Way to Open Adoption, Helping Your Child Grow Up Whole. And so let's talk about what this looks like. Let's break it down, because contact and openness are not the same thing, and that's what this grid shows us. All right, so if we're looking at, this was the first box on that grid, which was low contact and low openness. So this is the situation where limited information is available or provided, and there's very little contact with birth family. We're just speaking broadly birth family. Because we know sometimes contact with birth parents isn't possible, but maybe a grandmother, aunt and uncle, whatever it may be. So in this box as well, when we have low contact and low openness, that openness speaks to the fact that adoptive parents are reluctant to share information and or reluctant to discuss birth family. So that's the low openness that is reflected in that box. And because of that, a child doesn't feel like there's space for them to ask questions or express their feelings. And it can be challenging for a child who's experiencing this low contact and low openness, for them to integrate their identity, because they're left with a lot of questions and not space to pull things together or to explore or have a safe place to integrate. All right, so our next box is high contact but low openness. So that's box 2. And so this box includes perhaps obligatory or just, sort of begrudging contact with birth family, which could be exchange of photos, email, or even meetings, right? So we've got that high contact where we're seeing them, we're giving information, we're maybe receiving information, but there's low openness, which means that the adoptive parents aren't willing to sort of build that relationship. So maybe they are getting information, they're just passing it along to the child, or just taking information and passing it along to the birth family, or they're dropping a kid off for a visit and picking them up and not developing a relationship. And because of this lack of openness, the child is at a disadvantage because they feel split between birth family and adoptive family, right? They have both sets of contact, but they feel like there are divided loyalty issues that they have to navigate because they're getting messages from their adoptive parents that they are not comfortable and that they are not open to it and that they don't feel good about it. And again, these are concepts that can apply when a child is still in foster care and with a foster family. They may be navigating some of these things the same way. All right, so our third box is low contact and high openness. So sometimes, either because we don't have information or because it's not safe, we can't have that actual contact, but the parents still have a high degree of openness, right? They're still willing to share the information they have. They're still willing to let the kid ask questions. They're the parents who maybe bring it up from time to time to see how a kid is feeling. The parents who on Mother's Day are saying, hey, you know, I'm really thinking about your mom today. I wonder if you are. Or we have Father's Day coming up, same thing. Or on the kid's birthday. You know, these are families who, if they have pictures, they have those pictures of birth families around. They have the life book. They pull it out. They bring up birth family. And they are opening their hearts so their child can process their adoption story and integrate their identity. So that's the low contact and high openness. So let's look at our fourth box, which is high contact and high openness. And this is where, you know, we have birth family members who are maybe considered even extended family, that not only is there high contact, but there's high openness. There's this true integration of the families. Again, it may be no different than like, again, extended family, in-laws, what have you. And the relationships are focused on the child, and they are inclusive, right? So we're not necessarily having the same loyalty issues that may come up when we've got the high contact but low openness. And so this is what that grid is depicting. So I will stop to see sort of what questions you have, but I'm just going to go through a couple more slides. So what's best? So the degree of openness is the more important dynamic on this grid, right? Because contact is not something we can necessarily control. Either we don't have the information, or it's not safe, or as I mentioned before, we may have birth family members who find it too painful to have that contact. And so contact isn't necessarily something we can control, but open-heartedness is something that each parent has control over, and it does make a really big difference for how our child experiences it. So how do we do these things, right? We're gonna watch this video of a parent sharing her experiences, and then we will, again, I'll pause again for questions, and then we will take our break. So let me, oh, nope, wrong button. Sorry about that. Let me pull it back up. Okay. All right.
Just want to preface this in saying that.
All right. Once again, we can hear it? Yes? Thumbs up, somebody, you could hear it? I paused it.
Adoption is always, not always, but for the most part, always looked at this like beautiful thing, this beautiful celebration, and it totally is. It's a huge redemption story, and it's beautiful, and I love my kids, and I just love our relationship, and I love what God has made. But in all of their lives, it started with tragedy and a trauma, and even infants whose moms relinquished their rights, their birth moms relinquished their rights, it's still trauma for that child. There still can be PTSD, there still can be some traumatic tremors from that experience, even from birth. It's amazing what our body does when we are separated from our biological parents. Fact. In our state, in our area of the world in South Dakota, when a child comes into foster care, for instance, this is where we adopted from, they try to get the foster parents and the birth parents in the same room at the same time within a few weeks of the placement to talk about the child and kind of to break the ice on like the awkwardness of it, so that the foster parent isn't holding grudges against the birth parent, and the birth parent isn't holding grudges against the foster parent. Because if you can imagine the awkwardness of that situation, a lot of insecurities, a lot of insecurities on both ends of the spectrum. And I've experienced this myself when I adopted my older two boys about 6 years ago. We did not do that. We did not get placed in the same room with their birth mom. We just saw her around, we saw her at visits, but we were never formally introduced, and that has changed since then. And she also spoke a different language, so it was a little different, but they could have got interpreters. So it would have been better for us to meet her and to understand kind of where our children came from and get a better grip and understanding of their culture and who they are. And I just think it's so important for us as foster parents and adoptive parents to recognize that, because it is such a huge part of our child's life. I don't think we realize how much it means to our child to be connected to their roots and to their biological family. Even if they're not expressing it now, at some point in their life, they're gonna have to come to terms with what happened to them through being adopted. That child's gonna have to come to terms with that and figure out, okay, like, where am I at? Where's my heart? And they have to heal from the trauma of being separated from their parents. And we are working through that right now in multiple facets. As you guys know, we're adopting from China. And in the story of the person that we're adopting, we haven't announced who it is yet. There is a small chance that we could end up finding their birth parents at some point. And I think that would be really awesome for them. It sounds like it was a known abandonment. So that's kind of exciting for us, because thinking about adopting internationally, we lose that little piece of the puzzle for us, and that we won't know their birth parents, and we won't be able to communicate to them about who they were and how they cared about them in certain ways, or how their story played out. I know that it's not always possible for people to reconnect with birth families. I totally understand that. There's a million reasons why you wouldn't want to. But I want us to like stand back and kind of check our hearts a little bit and ask ourselves as adoptive parents, like, why is it that we don't want to connect with the birth parents? Is it because I'm afraid of them abusing my child? Am I afraid of how I'll feel? Will it confuse my children? I think it will confuse your children, of course, but will it be better for them in the long run to have that connection than not to have it at all? So I just made a small list actually for you guys of why connecting with birth parents would be a good idea. And then I'm going to share a story at the end here with you guys. So the first reason is pretty obvious to me. It's for medical records. Like, hey, do you have cancer in your family? It's really important. Like, do you have the BRCA gene? Like, is there liver cancer? Is there like hereditary things that we need to know about our child, and why they are the way they are? Did you drink with your child in the womb? There's just questions that we need to ask specifically, like, to shed some light on some areas of our child's life. When I go to the doctor, sometimes it's frustrating to me that I don't know their family history, and I really wish I would know those things so that I could be a better parent to them, and they could have that a part of them forever, and they could share it with their children, and so on and so forth. So that's a pretty big reason for you to reach out to birth parents, like specifically about medical reasons. And then to answer important questions, children will want to know these important questions, like if your child was adopted from birth and the mom decided to relinquish her rights towards that child, the child might want to know, like, why did you decide to do that? Sometimes the adoptive mom, like myself, I would know about that and I could share that with my child. But if I didn't know, it would be good for that child to know the reasons why they were placed for adoption. They relinquished their rights. That could be a lot of closure for the child if they just always assumed that they were unwanted their whole life, that they were unloved their whole life, and then they found out, oh, but really, mom, she just wasn't in the right place to parent because of XYZ, like maybe because she was 14, or maybe because she had an abusive relationship and she wanted to protect that child, or maybe she was addicted at the time and she didn't want to bring the child into that addiction with her. There's just a lot of reasons why people relinquish their rights to the children, and sometimes we don't see them as a good reason, but maybe it would bring closure to the child to know the reasons why, even if it's a bad reason. And maybe there's some other questions for the child, like culturally speaking. I think this is really important for my children specifically, because we are different ethnicities, to know their roots and like why their culture is the way it is. Like why do the Korean culture paint their face with this white paste, or why do they eat certain foods, or why do you wear these kind of like traditional clothes, and like why do you burn sage, like these different things that other cultures do that are foreign to us. It's just so important for us to have them connected to those things. And obviously we're going to raise them in our culture because we have our own culture, me and my husband, and your family does as well. As parents, you have your own culture. So I think those are really important. And then there's biological mirroring. This is another really good reason. We want our children to see what they look like their features of, okay, where did I get my nose from? Where did I get my mouth from? How am I going to look when I get older? Like, what are these things that they feel like they need to know? Like, when you look at your biological mother, do you think like, oh, I look just like my mother? Sometimes like when I look in the mirror, I'm like, oh, there's my mom over there. Nope, that's me. Like, we just look exactly alike. And sometimes that brings comfort, like that your mom is a part of you, kind of like in that way, not in a weird spiritual way, just in like a comforting way that will bring comfort and healing to your child. I think God could use those things to heal us and to bring us closer to closure. And that's my final point. It could bring healing to your child. It could bring a lot of confusion, but it could also bring a lot of healing. So it can bring a ton of healing to your child if you allow your heart to be brave enough to face your fears and to allow your children to connect with their biological parents or biological siblings or biological cousins or aunts and uncles and grandmas, as long as they are safe. Obviously, we need to be parents, and we need to make sure our children are safe.
So that was, again, an adoptive parent's perspective. I think it is important for us to
just want to preface
hear from the people living it. And I think she pulled together a lot of the things that we've talked about already in terms of why it can be so important for our kids to have the opportunity to have this information, to have contact. So she was demonstrating a high degree of openness, right? Is that openness, regardless of what that contact spectrum was going to look like, she was discussing that high degree of openness. So let me just cover briefly sort of what some of this looks like, and then we will take our break, and when we come back, I'll get to questions that are in the chat box. So when possible, we want to start planning what relationships and contact will look like before an adoption. The other piece, while a child is in foster care, she referenced something that I'm sure you guys know exists same here in Delaware, those icebreaker meetings, that the idea is to bring birth parents or whoever that previous caregiver was together with the parent providing foster care so that they can share those stories, and the birth parent can say, this is their routine, this is their favorite cereal, this is their favorite movie, whatever it may be, and to start building that connection. Because what we would like to see is those parents who are providing foster care, who we call resource parents, that they are not only a resource to that child, but a resource to those birth parents as well. And so establishing that connection early on powerful. And again, if it gets to that point where reunification isn't possible and adoption is what happens, we want to look at how is this gonna go? What is it all gonna look like? So again, post-adoption services are available to help assist families in navigating these complicated dynamics, and that can include, facilitating that contact or just providing support and guidance. It can be tailored to a situation. And so I think it's helpful for families to know sometimes that they don't have to be in it alone, because they can be very tricky things to navigate. So it is, all right, so it's just about 2 o'clock. So let's take a 10-minute break. We'll come back at 2:10 and finish our afternoon. And as I said, when we come back from the break, I'll get to questions in the chat box. So if you want to add any now, please do so. All right, so as promised, I'm going to take a look at the questions that were in the chat box. The primary one seems to be around, you know, a child who's nearly 4 or newly 4, and seems to be, you know, connecting with birth mom, but having several layers of people that they call mom and dad as a result of the foster process, and sort of, you know, should we be trying to clarify all, this is how I understand the question, you know, should we be trying to clarify all those things for a child who is just 4 years old, or do it later? And so what I would say is the answer is yes, sort of, right? Yes, we should be trying to help this child understand who the different people are in their life, but also we don't have to correct them every time, right? We don't have to say, no, this is so-and-so, or that's not, you know, just use some of the language, right? So for some folks, they use tummy mommy, some folks use first mommy, some folks use first name, you know, like Jessica mommy. However, you know, sort of folks feel like it might make sense for that child to reference different people. Let's just do that. Let's just use those labels so that it's present. And then as they get older, more specific conversations can be had, right? So then it can look like, you know how we talk about Jessica mommy? Let me explain what that means, who she is. Because one of the things we know is that kids, when they hear things like their whole life, when they're little, they don't necessarily understand what it all means. So this child could be 4 years old and you say tummy mommy every day, as opposed to foster mommy or adopted mommy or whoever, not that they would use those words, but they're not necessarily going to know or understand what it means. So when they're old enough to understand, then you'll explain it, but it will already have been part of the conversation all along. So the idea is that they should never really need to be told. It should just always be present. So I hope that answered what you were asking. If it doesn't, please feel free to unmute and ask. Thank you, I got the thumbs up, perfect. And if other folks have questions, please let me know. I do like that there was a comment in here just reflecting on, you know, that mom in the video, how trauma informed she was. You know, she really gets it. And I think the theme of what she was talking about, again, reflects the openness that we were talking about, and the understanding that this is about her children and their story. And I think the important piece is she was maybe setting aside or finding support to process some of the feelings she may have around all of that, but that she is sort of willing to set those things aside and make it about her kids and their story and what ultimately is best for them. So I agree. I think she really gets it. And I think it's a great example to see what it can look like. So again, I encourage you to add questions to the chat box. I'm going to pull up our PowerPoint again so we can get through our last bit here. And so the other piece around sort of how do we do these things, or what does this look like? No, nobody asked the question, but I'm sure it might have popped into your mind, which is, isn't it upsetting to kids to hear these things? Won't they act out? Won't it be hard? I think, as the mom said in that video, yes. Right? The answer is yes. There are things that are going to be hard around this, but we need to give our kids the support that they need to work through it. Avoiding it is not going to be helpful. You guys may have heard this before. It's a phrase that I like, which is the only way is through, right? That we have to go through when we try and go around things or under things or set things aside. It may help in a moment, but it is not going to help in the long term. We have to go through things. And so as our kids age and have the capacity to do that, we need to help them do that. Because if we avoid it until they're 14, I'm going to tell you, it's not going to go well. So we have to accept the reality that there's going to be some pain involved, and just make sure that we have the supports and knowledge to go through it, to do it. Okay, so I want to share this book. We're not going to go through all of this in detail. If you guys haven't heard of Sherry Eldridge, she has a lot of great resources around adoption, and this book is one that we think has a lot of great information. So it's 20 things adopted kids wish their adoptive parents knew. And so I listed out the 20 things. As I said, I'm not going to go through all of them, but I thought it was helpful to take a look again and look at what our kids wish their parents knew and could help them with, because it speaks to the importance of what we're talking about in terms of the openness around birth family, honoring those connections, respecting what that is, because it helps our kids in the long run. So again, I'm not going to go into detail of all of them, but I think it's important that we take a look. So that first one, I suffered a profound loss before I was adopted. You are not responsible, right? So this is the idea that if parents can sort of set aside some of their own feelings and just be there for what their child needs, right? So let's make this about the fact that, yes, the child experienced loss and that's something to be grieved. And as parents, you're not responsible for that. You're there to support them through it. I need to be taught that I have special needs arising from adoption, of which I need not be ashamed. So it's going back to the thing I've been saying all along, is that they need to know their story, because they need to know if there are challenges they are experiencing, it's because of these things that have happened to them. It's not because they're bad. It's not because they're broken. It's not because their parents were bad. It's because they've experienced maybe trauma or chronic stress, or that significant attachment disruption that has a huge impact. And so they need to know their story so they can make sense some of their own current challenges and take some of the shame out of it. Number 3, if I don't grieve my loss, my ability to receive love from you and others will be hindered. Again, we have to give them space for that, because if it's that ambiguous loss and it's just sitting out there and we haven't named it, we haven't grieved it, then it's going to get in the way. So I'm one of the other things I've heard and that I like is we can't grieve what we don't acknowledge, and so we have to acknowledge those losses and help our kids grieve. And then just an acknowledgement, last one, that unresolved grief can surface in anger, and often that anger is directed towards parents because they're the safest people to direct anger towards, and it can be very easy to, if I haven't processed the grief or acknowledged the grief that I feel around the loss of parents, I'm going to take it out on the parent in front of me. All right, so now we have 5. I need you help in my grieving my loss, right? And number 6 is one I talked about already. Just because I don't talk about my birth family doesn't mean I don't think about them, right? It is present. So that's why we need number 7, which is I want you to take the initiative in opening conversations about my birth family. It creates that sense of safety. It gives safety. It gives them permission. So number 8, I need to know the truth of my conception and birth family history, no matter how painful the details may be. Number 9, I'm afraid I was given away by my birth mother because I was a bad baby. I need you to help dump my toxic shame. So again, I know we talked about this already, but I think it bears repeating, which our kids often internalize the reasons why they are in foster care, the reasons why their parent couldn't care for them as something that was wrong with them, that they did wrong, that they weren't good enough, that they were bad in some way, that they weren't lovable. And so we need to help them, as it says here, dump their toxic shame so that they don't have this number 10, afraid, that they'll be abandoned again, because that's how they experienced it. They were abandoned and rejected, and they're afraid that it will happen again. Which is another reason why the more they understand their story and the details of it and why it happened and why their parents struggled, it takes away this feeling that it was just because they were bad, or the things I've projected into this story because I didn't know the actual information. Number 11, I may appear more whole than I actually am. I may need your help to uncover parts of myself that I keep hidden so I can integrate all the parts of my identity. It just speaks to the need to understand their story, to know those details. And I really think that this relates to number 12. I need to gain a sense of personal power. I think having information is empowering, right? Knowing your story is empowering. Our kids lose so much power and control when they're involved with foster care, and often when they're involved with an adoption, because it's not necessarily something that they chose, that knowing their story and getting to talk about their story and getting to make sense of their story, it empowers them, and that is huge. Number 13, please don't say I look or act just like you. I need you to acknowledge and celebrate our differences. That goes back to honoring birth family connections, right? Honoring where a child came from. There are ways in which it can be nice to feel connected in those ways. Like, did you know that we say this one thing alike all the time? Or did you know that, this or that, like, we have the same color eyes? That, to a child who's been adopted or a child who's in foster care, it's going to feel dismissive of where they came from. And where they came from needs to be honored and acknowledged. And so I think it's okay to acknowledge some of those things, but make sure you're also acknowledging the ways in which we're not the same, and the ways in which, yeah, our eyes are both green, but yours are the exact same shade as your birth father's. Isn't that cool? Whatever it may be, whatever way we can connect them to where they came from. Number 14, let me be my own person, but don't let me cut myself off from you. So this is that challenge that we often have in parenting of giving our kids space, but not letting them get too far. So we have to give them space to become their own person, to figure out their identity, and to maybe, again, be exploring their birth family. But we also want to be with them as much as we can in doing those things so that they don't get too far. Because even if they say it or show it through some actions, what they ultimately want is to feel safe and to feel loved and to have that, to be with a parent. So we have to find that balance of giving them space but not letting them get too far. Number 15, please respect my privacy regarding my adoption. Don't tell others without my consent. That is a tricky one for parents to navigate, especially in transracial adoption, because you're more likely to get the questions from the stranger in the grocery store or the kid at school. And so having some game plans for your child and for yourself or for parents of how they're going to navigate that is really important. When kids are old enough to be asked about that, they should be asked about that. And kids as old, as young as 6, they can be asked about that. And there are ways you can navigate it to say, all right, honey, do you want to take the question this time or do you want me to? Which in one way also reminds the person who asked it, like, this is their story. They're a person, even though they're a kid. And it gives the child some power within it. 16, birthdays and other holidays and milestones may be difficult for me. That, I think there are obvious reasons why that's true, that those pieces are their family time and, birthday, of course you're going to think about birth parents or siblings on your birthday. And so again, as we can acknowledge that for our kids, it gives them space to have their feelings. And then, as the mom speaking in the video noted, not knowing the full medical history can be distressing. And it's also one of those things that can be a reminder again and again and again of information you don't have, and the difference that your experience, the way your experience is different from another person's experience, right? Every time you go to the doctors, every time you have to answer a question that you don't have the information for, it can be hard. All right, let's look at our last few. I am afraid I will be too much for you to handle. Our kids often have a lot of challenges, and there's a part of them that gets afraid that, again, that they'll be abandoned or rejected, that they're going to be too much. So sometimes, what does that mean? That they push and push and push and are the most that they can be because they're trying to test it out, because they'd rather know now than later. They'd rather know now than to get secure and comfy and then be blindsided by it at some point. So you have to stick with them while they test those boundaries. Which speaks to number 19, when I act out my fears in destructive ways, please hang in there with me and respond wisely, right? That we have to not take it personally. We have to hang in there when our kids are pushing and are perhaps destructive, because it does come from a place of fear, and often feelings that, that fear of rejection or abandonment. So seeing that for what it is makes a big difference. I was watching another training this week and talking about this concept that the way that we explain or sort of interpret a behavior drives the way we respond. And so if we can understand and interpret these behaviors as rooted in fear, then we will be more likely to respond in a supportive way as opposed to a punitive way. And then this last one, even if I decide to search for my birth family, you will always be my parents. And so, again, it speaks to that idea that there's room enough for everyone, right? There's room enough for a child to have connections and feelings related to their birth family, right? So they can be connected with birth family members. They can have those relationships. They can think about them and care about them, and still have those parts of themselves available for their foster family and their adoptive family. That there's room for all, and that as caregivers, foster and adoptive parents need to make sure that, again, they're giving them enough space for those things, and also with them so that they can go through it together. So that's 20 Things by Sherry Eldridge. Again, she has a lot of great resources. So I'm going to pause here and see if there are any questions, because we actually just have a little bit and then we're going to finish up. So if you have questions, things that you want that haven't been covered and you want to make sure are covered, please take advantage of the chat box. All right, so I'm going to briefly talk about post-op services, and then I'll go back to that chat box and see what questions or topics maybe you guys put in there that you want to make sure we hit on before we finish up. So again, just wanted you to be aware of post-adoption services, because a lot of the navigation of birth family can be difficult, and as a child ages, those dynamics can change. And so it may be something that looks one way, while a child is in foster care and when an adoption finalized, and then 2 years later, things have really shifted and they need some support. And so, as I mentioned in the beginning, A Better Chance for Our Children provides post-adoption services, and those are available to any family that lives in Delaware and has adopted. So if they have adopted, even if it was international or in another state, whatever form or fashion, and they live in Delaware, they qualify for these services. They also qualify if they have permanent guardianship of a child who is in foster care in Delaware. And so wanting you guys just to know that this is something that is available and is funded through the state. So this includes support groups, crisis and case management, and then also some respite options. So the last slide has my contact information on it, which you can also get from Lauren if you have additional questions or information that you are looking for. So let me hop back out to the chat box and see what questions that you folks may have. And again, feel free to unmute and ask questions, or, I don't know, concerns, personal experiences, anything that you feel like might be helpful. I know, once again, I was just so thorough and so good at explaining things that we've got nothing. I'm going to take it. How I'm going to choose to interpret it, because I get to make my own narrative.